Dear Westminster Councillors, you have inherited an unpopular, unsuccessful, incredibly expensive and harmful policy from your predecessors. Worse, I'm pretty sure that the people managing that policy are intentionally lying to you. I've spent the last month going through the 114-page report titled Busking and Street Entertainment Licensing Policy Review Report. It was drafted in order for you to debate in October. Unfortunately, I believe that it contains multiple demonstrable lies and distortions. The report's executive summary says that during the 2 years of operation, there was a notable increase in complaints related to busking. That's its basic message. Complaints about street performers have gone up. Here's how the newspapers covered the report. Buskers face West End crackdown as complaints rise. Crackdown on buskers after thousands of noise complaints. Crackdown on buskers after noise complaints skyrocket. But this is based on a total misrepresentation of the facts. Here's a chart in the report that shows the total number of complaints in the borough over the last 4 years. It clearly demonstrates that after 2 relatively stable years, complaints visibly shot up in 2021 and are still really high in 2022. That chart is lying. It shows that between April and December 2019, buskers received 959 complaints. But we have the raw complaints from earlier Freedom of Information requests. The real figure during those months is 1,693 complaints, a 77% increase on what's shown, and, importantly, higher than the complaints that the council claims buskers received in 2022. No other chart in the entire document lays out pre-license and post-license complaints, so this is the only graphic in the report showing a visual representation of whether complaints have gone up or down, and it's lying. But the misrepresentation is way worse and goes far further than a single graphic. It's clear that there was a spike in 2021. Helpfully, the council, eventually, gives 3 reasons why complaints might have gone up that year, which have nothing to do with the buskers. First, they admit that an expectation was established when the scheme was introduced that the council would have the resources to actively ensure compliance. In other words, if people thought their complaints would mean more, they'd be more likely to complain. They also admit that the council has also made it easier for residents and businesses to report complaints, so a higher percentage of those who wanted to complain would actually go through with it. Third, COVID was a factor. Since they'd been deathly quiet during lockdowns, once they ended, the return of activity that generated any noise could have given rise to additional complaints at the time. But that's not the only thing that COVID changed. The council should have gone on to mention that in 2021 a lot more people were working from home, right next to the pitch. Businesses near pitches, actually businesses nationwide, were being told to keep their windows open, letting air out and, obviously, sound in. But perhaps more than anything else, the consultation itself, by way of the council going around and speaking to locals, acted as an advertisement for the complaint system. The rise in 2021 might simply have been because suddenly people had discovered that there was a complaint system. So more people knew how to complain, it was easier to complain, people were more likely to complain. COVID forced people to work from home, businesses to open their windows, and had created temporary silence that suddenly ended in 2021. Any discussion about the complaints data that doesn't start with all that context is borderline fraudulent. It's definitely bad science. But once you've seen how much complaints have reduced since 2021, it looks highly suspect for the council to ignore all that. Here's how they begin talking about complaints. Since the introduction of the scheme, the council has received 5,070 complaints within the period of April 21 to May 2023. On average, the council receives around 2,200 complaints per year relating to buskers and street entertainers. They don't spell it out for you, but 5,070 complaints in 26 months is an average of 2,340 per year. So yes, higher than normal. But let's look at the first chart again. Did you notice that it left out 2018 with no explanation? What about the fact that it leaves out January to March? So let's add those back in and add the months that we have data for in 2023 and then look at the average complaints per month for each of those years so that we can compare apples to apples. If you do that, you get this. Immediately you can see that 2022 and 2023 had fewer complaints per month than 2019. That's a pretty big difference to the council forced to act after complaints skyrocket claim put out in the press. Also, the dotted line is 183 complaints per month. That's what you get if you divide 2,200 complaints per year, that's what the council says it normally gets, by 12. You can see that 2019 was worse than average, 2022 was average, and 2023, so far, has been much better than average. The council could claim that that's just a seasonal thing. After all, this doesn't include 2023's summer data. We also don't have full data for all of the seasons, so again, we'll divide the latest data by season and then get monthly averages. Here's what that looks like. What a different story. If you were in charge of writing this report and wanted the buskers to look bad, you could first lie about how good things used to be, then group all the complaints from the last 2 years into one lump sum and put that up top. But if you wanted to be honest about what was actually happening, you'd give people the context first, explaining why external factors and not buskers are the likely cause of the initial bump in complaints. Then you'd show that the rate of complaints was average last year and below average this year. And if you really wanted to dig down, you'd mention that complaints went down every season for an entire year and that complaints have been way below average since autumn 2022. That's the truth, and yet the council simply put, there was a notable increase in complaints related to busking. In the report, it states that it is important to inform buskers that they may need to obtain a Performing Rights Society license. The council should provide an advisory section within the policy relating to the liability associated with royalties, and that this rests solely with the licensed busker. It's a little confusing and the typos don't help, but basically the council's saying that it's up to buskers within Westminster's busking programme to pay for a license to perform copyrighted music during their shows. Well, that's a little weird, isn't it? No busker has ever been sued for playing copyrighted music, and buskers being legally protected in their own actions seems to have little to do with reducing complaints. Why is this one of the 17 changes that the report's authors make? So, I asked an employee of PRS why he thought Westminster included this. He told me on the phone that this was a question for their local authorities team, and he'd forward them my question. They never got back to me, so I emailed Hayley Bosher, a reader in intellectual property law and associate dean at Brunel University, London. Bosher produces Whose Song Is It Anyway?, a podcast devoted to issues surrounding intellectual property law and music, and is the author of a book titled Copyright in the Music Industry, a practical guide to exploiting and enforcing rights. We organised a phone call. On it, I told her the council's position. She called that position completely wrong. She explained that PRS charges local authorities for the use of live music on busking pitches. The moment the council demarcated when and where buskers could perform, they'd essentially created a busking venue and should have started paying the local authorities' tariff, and that's £10.93 per day. As for the buskers themselves, PRS say, buskers who perform in the designated areas need to report each performance to receive a royalty fee for each busking session. To be clear, if a busker performs on a pitch created by a council, PRS will pay that busker for providing their music to the public, £1.47 per show. In other words, the music license fees that councils pay PRS are redistributed to the street performers who busk on their pitches. The council's position is not just entirely backwards, it robs buskers of the money that's lawfully and rightfully theirs. Which presents us with two really distasteful options. Why has the council's legal team got a clearly written law so wrong? The first option is incompetence. Maybe the council's lawyer simply didn't understand the above. I don't believe that. There's no grey area here. The law is clear. The other option is they're lying. Obviously, I'm not in the heads of the report's authors, but I can only think of one persuasive reason for them to lie, is that the council is trying to save money. Now, £10.93 isn't much per day, but as of writing this, the regime has been active for 880 days. Multiply that by 26 pitches, and by now they should have spent £250,078. If the council has avoided paying the PRS licence, then they have effectively stolen over £250,000 and counting from the UK's musicians. The report uses the exact phrase illegal busker 39 times to describe performers who haven't got their legally mandated licence. To save time, and because I'm not petty, I won't refer to Westminster as the illegal council from now on. I could. Presumably the report's authors would agree that I should. Especially as it doesn't seem to be the only crime that the council has been committing here. On the application form to get a licence, it asks performers to state their union membership status. According to every legal service and advisory body I could find, it's highly unethical for an authority to ask such a question. According to a high-ranking union rep I got in touch with, unrelated to busking but familiar with the law, it is plainly illegal to make decisions based on whether or not someone has trade union membership, so asking that question is at best pointless, and at worst a crime that could lead to legal actions being taken against the council. Also, according to the protections enshrined in the Data Protection Act of 2018, union membership status is regulated under Conditions for Sensitive Processing. The council has no need, right, or incentive to know if a busker is a member of a union, so storing that data might be a crime even if they don't act upon it. Here are a couple of sentences taken from the report's executive summary talking about how the council views its own efforts. The original intention of the scheme was to have a light touch approach, emphasising self-regulation based on a code of conduct, and later that the policy was an effort to establish a light touch licensing regime with the aim of self-regulation. A light touch, self-regulated regime. Cool, so let's start with self-regulation. I think we can all agree that there is regulation and self-regulation. Regulation, in this case, would include the application rules, stating who is eligible for a license, and the terms under which you can get your license suspended, like busking in the wrong place. If you don't have a license, you'll be busking illegally, and if you go against the terms, you'll lose your license. The regulations state that illegal busking can lead to you being fined, taken into custody, or have your equipment confiscated. All the above clearly falls under the heading regulation. As for self-regulation, the council has provided a voluntary code of conduct to follow. It says that buskers should hold public liability insurance of at least £2 million, don't use dangerous props, don't bring unlicensed animals to accompany you, only busk between the hours of 10 AM and 9 PM, avoid being too loud, don't power amps with external power sources, be aware that noise can be generated by the audience, never obstruct property entrances or exits or pavements, cooperate with requests by authorised officers and the police, only sell merch if you have permission, make sure that no one could trip over your equipment or leave it unattended, respect other buskers and cooperate with any queuing system they have, talk to the council and the local community and use the forum, don't busk for longer than 40 minutes with a 20-minute break, and have a full and varied repertoire. In actual fact, the first 11 items on that list are part of the policy and application process. There's nothing voluntary about them. It's only the last 5 that are voluntary. When the council says that it was intended that the scheme would be self-regulating, unfortunately this has not been the case, are they talking about these 5 points? Because there isn't a single complaint between 2017 and 2019 about respect between buskers or unattended equipment. As for point 3, it was up to the council to implement the forum, and they decided not to. The 40-minute show, 20-minute break rule shouldn't be there at all. In the first draft of the policy, this used to be in the license conditions, but so many buskers complained about this specific point that the council agreed to take it out. It's probably an oversight that it has somehow remained in the Code of Conduct, which means that the only thing in the Code of Conduct that could be considered self-regulating or important is that last point, having a full and varied repertoire. Is that really what the report means when they say that the licensing regime was supposed to be self-regulating? All the other things they complain about are either irrelevant or literal crimes by the terms of the policy. I'm not sure what else is left up to the busker. Talking of crimes, calling the licensing regime light touch is just as misleading. First of all, the policy limits legal busking to just 26 pitches. All of those 26 pitches add up to a combined 207 square meters of floor space where it is legal to busk in a borough with an area of 21.47 million square meters. The statement then that the policy is not light touch because it has made it a crime to busk in Westminster is, therefore, only 99.999% correct. They don't even make the pitches big enough when there's tons of space. Here's a photo of the northeast pitch in Leicester Square. The entire show has to fit into that circle. Every instrument, every dancer, every prop, as well as the performer's equipment case, amplifier, and whatever else they use. What you're looking at is one of only 5 pitches in the entire borough where amplification is allowed, and it is tiny. Still, while limited space might be an issue, limited time is what makes this license completely untenable. Between the 26 pitches in Westminster's scheme, there are a maximum of 267 hours on which to busk per day. That might sound like a lot, but Leicester Square and Trafalgar Square are often closed for events, knocking that figure down to 246 hours. Take off another 5% for London's famously bad weather. That's a complete guess, by the way, but every estimate I've gotten from buskers is even worse. And you're left with just 233 hours of licensed pitch time per day. There are something like 600 street performers busking in Westminster. You can see how I got to that decision in the appendix accompanying this video, but there are a few ways of getting to that figure. Equally shared out, each of those 600 performers could perform daily for about 23 minutes on licensed pitches. However, there are only 5 pitches in Westminster that allow amplification. One of them, the council decided, should go on a traffic island in the middle of a 2-lane roundabout, a placement so dangerous that buskers have to stop performing the moment they get a crowd. Another amplified pitch was placed all the way out in an unpopular location in Marble Arch, a pitch that's so low earning that nobody uses it. That leaves just 3 viable amplified pitches. This means that, on average, each busker would get just 2.4 minutes of amplified licensed pitch time per day, or a full 40-minute show once every 2.5 weeks. Busking on 99.999% of council land, with or without a license, is a crime. Not adhering to their rules is a crime. There's neither enough time nor space to perform. The license all but eliminates amplification, and everything is backed with the threat of arrest and having the tools of your livelihood confiscated. If that's light touch, I dread to think what else the council was considering. The policy criminalised a lot more. The standard license conditions, point 14, states, no naked flame, pyrotechnics, fireworks, knives, sharp objects or similar should be used as part of the performance. I asked the buskers to estimate what proportion of West Piazza shows contain dangerous props, and, unsurprisingly, they said it was about 90%. In other words, only 10% of the shows on the West Piazza, London's most iconic busking pitch, could even busk within the terms of the license. Everyone else would get a license, break the rules by using dangerous props, immediately lose their license, and end up where they started. What would be the point of signing up to that? The policy also makes getting a license an impossibility for performers visiting from other countries. In its licensing application process and procedures, they say that a performer needs a declaration of right to work in the UK. But according to the person I spoke to at Viva La Visa, who are entertainingly named specialists covering visas in the entertainment industry, buskers don't need the right to work. There's no artist or work visa that covers street performance, and buskers are allowed to get remuneration under the tourist visa as long as it's not part of a contract. This is no small thing. It's not just tourists that come from all over the world to visit the West Piazza, it's also buskers. Many incredible internationally touring street shows put Covent Garden's cobblestones on their world tours, and it's brilliant. Not just because locals get to see a constant change in the roster of performers there, but because it does wonders for local businesses. The volunteer directors of the Covent Garden Street Performers Association were therefore given a choice. They could get their members to sign up to a license that makes most of their shows illegal, or continue, business as usual, by telling their members to ignore the license. They chose the latter. Is that how the council report presented the facts? Of course not. Its authors instead suggested that the SBA told their members not to get licenses because they wanted to have the flexibility to move around the city and not have specific rules or conditions that, if breached, could lead to the loss of their license and, therefore, their livelihood or a criminal conviction. Well, that makes it sound like the buskers wanted to be lawless, roaming vagabonds. Sure, the Covent Garden SPA didn't think that buskers should be stripped of their livelihoods and treated like criminals, but the basic fact is that the license excluded them. Later on, the report suggests 5 more reasons why a busker might not decide to sign up for the license, 3 of which were, they may have criminal records, they wish to avoid scrutiny from state agencies such as HMRC, or they do not agree that the licensing regime should apply to them. It may be useful for the council to portray the buskers as tax-dodging criminals who believe they're above the law, but there are lots of other reasons why someone might not sign up. For example, the SPA already self-manages in a way that virtually eliminates noise complaints and have done for decades. They use so-called dangerous props in their shows, so they couldn't get a license. They couldn't provide a right-to-work declaration because it doesn't exist. They can't afford the public liability insurance mandated by the council. They are homeless and can't provide the home address required on a license application. They don't speak English as a first language and were unable to navigate the council's English-only website. There simply isn't enough space for everyone to perform legally, so what's the point of even trying? They don't believe that a relatively new council should be able to criminalise a cultural tradition dating back at least 3 centuries in London. Or they are offended at how the council has treated them, by, for example, suggesting that they are tax-dodging criminals who think they're above the law. Ignoring all that, and instead questioning the morals of unlicensed buskers, is an awful, insulting misrepresentation that shouldn't have made it into an official council document. In fact, an increasing number of performers that I've talked to now believe, not without evidence, that because of misrepresentations just like this, the report's authors are out to get the street performers associations in London. But more on that later. This one's a bit weird, but the council seems to have a problem with determining the biggest or highest in a numeric set. I have 2 examples of this, one of which is comical, the other is unethical. The report showed this graph of how many complaints they received per month. They said it shows the highest number of complaints were received in August 2021 and January 2022. That might be a funny error, but it appears that the council also don't know how to focus on its complaint hotspots. The report repeatedly claims that Leicester Square and Covent Garden are its 2 worst areas, and therefore need the most airtime. Unfortunately, the Council still hasn't released the redacted complaints data for the period since the policy went into place, so we can't double-check their maths. But we can get a feel for how bad things were in Covent Garden and Leicester Square by looking at the complaints data from 2017 to 2019. That dataset has 3,990 complaints in total. Of those, the 2 pedestrianised plazas and tourist hotspots, Leicester Square and Covent Garden, received 215 and 24 complaints respectively. At the same time, Oxford Street appeared in the complaints 1,136 times. Anyone who's been on Oxford Street knows that it's a busy shopping road with thousands of people walking on it, and that it's not pedestrianised, meaning traffic fatalities are a distinct possibility there. There are also complaint hotspots on Oxford Street, like a spot in front of Selfridges that came up 230 times, more than the entirety of Leicester Square. Oxford Street isn't mentioned in the 2023 report, nor is Villiers Street, which between 2017 and 2019 got 269 complaints. Nor, in fact, were any of these locations mentioned. However, there were 3 locations that the report focused on again and again: Leicester Square, Trafalgar Square, and Covent Garden. Were the complaints about these locations between 2021 and 2023 far higher than the others on this list? If so, I can think of only 3 options why. One is that the regime successfully managed to reduce complaints everywhere else. That would be an incredible achievement. However, if they had done that, surely they wouldn't be calling their own regime a failure. It would have been a stunning success, and the Council would be congratulating themselves. Another option is that the Council took these 3 popular, beloved, pedestrianised tourism hotspots in which busking has taken place for centuries and absolutely ruined them, so much so that they take up all the airtime in a 114-page document. There is a third option, that the Council has singled out these 3 areas for attention because they all share something in common. They're all plazas, but I don't see how that would be an issue. They're all pedestrianised, but you'd imagine that that would work in their favour. The only other similarity that all 3 share is that they are performed on by buskers enrolled in street performers associations. Surely the report's authors aren't just singling out SBA pitches, right? Before you answer that question, consider this. The 2023 report has this to say about self-regulation in Covent Garden. The Covent Garden SPA suggested self-regulation or a scheme similar to the one used in the past. Self-regulation has been considered previously, but issues with obstruction and noise persisted. To see what they meant by previously, I looked at the Council's busking policy report draft in 2020, published in December of that year. This is the final report calling for a new busking licence in Westminster, and it's the one that influenced the councillors to vote. In it, it says, having an SPA has provided the Council and businesses in the area a location-based code of conduct designed specifically for the area. Complaints, however, continue to arise even here. That complaints continued to arise was a surprise to everyone at the time. The buskers in Covent Garden were adamant that there were no issues with the complaints on their pitches. Who was correct? Let's find out. The Covent Garden Street Performers Association manages 2 pitches. One of them is the iconic St. Paul's pitch, otherwise known as the West Piazza. That's the famous one. The other is Magic Corner, right at the end of James Street. The former is exclusively used by circle shows, the latter exclusively by, you guessed it, magicians. Both are active for about 10 hours a day and both are fully amplified. Here's how the Council describes their organisation in their 2023 report. The Covent Garden Street Performers Association has been operating since the 1980s and has implemented a performer-run and self-regulated system with its own rules, governing body and disciplinary scheme, dealing with any problematic performers and ensuring insurance coverage and acceptable noise levels. They utilise a yellow and red card approach for addressing misconduct, including suspensions for repeated bad behaviour. Sounds great, but does their system work? Maybe not. Between 2017 and 2019, there were 180 complaints about busking noise on James Street. However, 3 of them weren't about buskers at all, 24 were up the other end of James Street, 1 was all the way over on Oxford Street, 42 of them were about musicians, not magicians. 70 of the complaints, therefore, were definitely not about SPA pitches. Magicians, on the other hand, were only mentioned 8 times. However, there were 7 complaints that used some form of the word shouting, so they probably were about the magicians as well, who tend to talk more than play music. Let's assume all 15 of those complaints were about CGSPA members. Of the 85 complaints that we can identify, 15 were probably about CGSPA buskers and 70 weren't. That means roughly 18% of complaints were covered by the Covent Garden Street Performers Association. There are still 96 complaints remaining, 25 of them mention amplified music. I reckon that means that they were more likely to be about musicians, but as magicians do sometimes perform with backing tracks, we'll ignore that. Multiplying that 96 by the 1570 ratio above, which is our best guess for how many of those indeterminate complaints were actually about magicians, you get another 17 complaints, bringing the total to 32. As for the West Piazza, there were 24 complaints listed as being in Covent Garden between 2017 and 2019. Well, 2 definitely weren't on the West Piazza. 2 were about buskers up the other end of James Street next to Covent Garden Tube Station. 1 of them was actually a complaint about a council official, and 7 were about musicians. That's 12 that definitely weren't the responsibility of the SPA. There was only 1 complaint that was definitely about a busker performing on the St. Paul's pitch. That's another name for the West Piazza. Funnily enough, that's the same number of complaints against the council officer. Anyway, 1 definitely about SPA buskers, 12 definitely not about SPA buskers. That's a rate of 8%. Doing the same maths as before, the West Piazza may have gotten 2 complaints in total. On James Street, 32 complaints. On the West Piazza, 2 complaints. That's a grand total of 34 complaints about SPA-run pitches over a period of 24 months. That's 17 complaints a year. Put another way, for every complaint that the Covent Garden Street Performers Association received in that period, they'd performed, always amplified, for 472 hours. It seems then that amplification is not the problem. The Covent Garden SPA's code of conduct and system for disciplining its members is enough. Perhaps that's unsurprising, given that their methodology has been practiced and refined over the decades, and that it has 100% buy-in from its members. Considering this success, it's no wonder that the SPA had an agreement with the council and the market's private land managers since 2007. Of course they do. In return, approximately 45 million people visit Covent Garden each year, and the street performers there are loudly promoted as the best reason to visit in every tourism guide or online review website like TripAdvisor or Google Maps. What proportion of those 45 million people come to watch the buskers? 1 million? 2? How many tens of millions of pounds in tourism spend do those buskers bring in? Or, put another way, the Borough of Westminster got almost 2,000 complaints per year over this period. Covent Garden SPA pitches received just 17. Surely, this would convince the council to leave Covent Garden as is. Apparently not. Instead of congratulating them for a phenomenal job reducing complaints, that 2020 report was worded to make the SPA sound ineffective. Even worse, the buskers were completely blindsided. In all previous discussions, it was clear that Covent Garden would be left out of the licensing regime. Here's what the SPA thought about it, according to the authors of the Council's 2023 report. In Covent Garden, they believe there are limited noise issues associated with buskers and street performers. Initially, Covent Garden was not included in the busking and street entertainment licensing regime, but was added late in the process with no clear justification or reasoning. That's not a belief, that's a fact. There was no justification or reasoning in that 2020 report for why suddenly Covent Garden had been added to the license. If that decision was the result of any debate, that debate was behind closed doors and never explained. Try to put yourself for a second in the position of a Covent Garden Street Performers Association manager. 40 years of history, a robust system of self-regulation, a clean record, a good relationship with local businesses and the landlord and the council, and then, with no explanation, the council criminalises the vast majority of your shows. Is it any wonder that the Street Performers Association recommended to their members that they shouldn't sign up for a license? Unfortunately, making that recommendation put the SPA in a tricky position. The 3 key characteristics of what's called an organised crime group is that they have a hierarchy, a profit motive, and commit a series of crimes over an extended period of time. The SPA is run by a few volunteers, the shows the buskers put on make money, and every one of them is a criminal act. In other words, Westminster City Council has turned the CGSPA into the busker mafia. I made that joke in a group chat with some SPA members. They didn't find it funny. The council has already used the term mafia in meetings to describe us, one said. Let's not do that work for them. So, that's the context. Let's look at the period of 2021 to 23. Why was Covent Garden the second most talked about area in the latest report? Is it because the council wants to attack the SPA, or is it because of complaints? The report claims that 305 complaints are situated within Covent Garden. Wow. The Covent Garden buskers put in another Freedom of Information request asking for the latest data, and for the first time, without explanation, the data the council produced was stripped of any identifying features. Why the change in policy? Unclear. but let's just take 140 complaints a year as the truth. According to previous data, only 8% of Covent Garden complaints are about the West Piazza. Assuming the same holds true today, then the West Piazza received 11 complaints per year. During the year, the buskers put on 4,866 shows on the West Piazza. So even if we are to believe that Covent Garden is suddenly 12 times as bad as it used to be, still, for every complaint received about the West Piazza, the buskers there put on 442 shows. Now, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but some of the buskers are beginning to believe that as they are objectively doing a good job, and have done for decades, the report's authors have focused so much on Covent Garden pitches and been so misleading because they're trying to punish the SPA for ignoring the license. And it's worth repeating, that's a license that only 10% of their members could even get because it bans everyone else's shows. According to the report, engagement with and cooperation from street performers are equally essential to enforcement. There are multiple requests over its 114 pages to increase enforcement powers and resources, but nowhere does it suggest any method of how to get the buskers more on board. Well, an apology would be a good start. There's a chance that none of the errors highlighted so far were intentional. Still, people apologise for their own mistakes, conscious or not. It's part of British culture. So here's a short summary of the things so far that the council could or should apologise for. Showing that complaints before the licence were lower than they actually were. Muddying the stats to hide the fact that complaints have been below average for months. Not giving the proper context for why complaints initially went up in 2021. Stealing £250,000 by illegally not paying the PRS licence, if indeed they haven't. At best, straying over ethical boundaries by asking about union membership status, pretending the policy was self-regulated, pretending the policy was light touch, ignoring that they criminalised most of the shows in Covent Garden. Actually, if we pause the apologies just for a second, I want to quickly note that since I made the earlier part of the video about the fact that the council criminalised the majority of the shows put on by members of the Covent Garden SPA, I had this back and forth with the council. Me. There are no visas that cover busking. Them. Actually, here's a link to where they can get confirmation of the right to work. I checked out that link and it says that the buskers need either a residence card or a visa. Me. But travelling buskers won't have a residence card or a visa, so that link doesn't work. So, has Westminster banned travelling street performers? Them. Yes, unfortunately we cannot permit travelling visitors to perform as a busker. The council's licensing regime began on April 5th, 2021. We had that conversation on September 15th, 2023, 893 days later. And I believe that this is the first time that the council has ever written publicly that internationally travelling street performers are banned from busking in Westminster. In fact, it sounds like this might be the first time the council realised that it has banned internationally travelling street performers. Let's just take a minute to read the first paragraph of the council's December 2020 report. Located in the heart of central London, Westminster's streets are brought to life with performances by buskers who come from all over the world to perform here and play an important role in the vibrancy of our city. That's paragraph 1.1, page 1. I think that the council accidentally banned travelling buskers. Just straight up banned one of the best things about London's street scene by accident. I have asked the council whether this was an oversight or intentional, and hopefully they'll get back to me before I've reached the end of making this video. But in any case, this just adds weight to why the Covent Garden Street Performers Association suggested that buskers ignore the licensing regime. Which leads us back to our apology list. The council should also apologise for suggesting that buskers who didn't get a licence might be tax-dodging criminals, ignoring the incredible success the Covent Garden SPA had at reducing noise complaints, using non-relevant complaints as grounds to say that self-regulation doesn't work on pitches managed by the SPAs, and publishing a single, one-sided, exaggerated and flawed impact report by a business that really doesn't know what it is that makes Leicester Square special. As for the 4 possible crimes that the council has committed, possibly lying in a legal opinion, possibly avoiding paying a music royalties license, possibly going against data protection laws, and possibly breaking union discrimination laws, perhaps instead of an apology, the police should just investigate and take it from there. They should also apologise for trying to eliminate the street performers associations. Back in 2020, the council set up a forum for discussions about the new licensing regime. It was described as a bridge between the busking community and our local residents and businesses in order to foster good relations and open communication and to promote partnership. Sounds good, but for some reason in 2023, now they're saying that business and residents associations should be excluded from the forum, as well as unlicensed buskers. It is believed, it says, that a new forum should be established which is specifically for licensed buskers. Instead of a bridge to a local community, the forum will now just be a communication channel between licensed buskers and the council's enforcement team. That may not sound like a direct attack on the street performers associations until you read the report's 15th recommendation that direct references to the two current SPAs should be removed from the policy, because the policy should only promote SPAs who represent licensed buskers. What happened to the Council's 2020 claim that they will continue to support established and newly created SPAs across the city who play a vital and important role in supporting engagement between performers and with the wider community to foster good relations with all users of the shared public space? And is the Council really saying that they'll only engage with street performers associations who mandate that 100% of their members get licenses? And if that wasn't enough, the report then recommends that the Council should consider listing recognised SPAs, as well as their contact information on the Council's website. That's Machiavellian. The Council will no longer speak to the current street performer associations, they will no longer mention those two SPAs on its policy document, and if a future SPA wants to get such privileges, they can, but only if they agree to solely represent licensed street performers. But what about the Leicester Square SPA? The 2023 report states that their members were mostly licensed, expressed a willingness to collaborate, and the council's own officers even suggested engaging with them. It also says that officers met with the LSSPA on several occasions during this review. They were very helpful in discussing the issues that they have had with the licensing scheme and policy, as well as considering the issues that businesses have faced in and around Leicester Square. Sounds like the council would agree to collaborate, just so long as the Leicester Square Street Performers Association makes a rule change that 100% of their members have to get a busking license. Great, so let's do a thought experiment. Let's say that the Leicester Square SPA makes that change. Any of their members and representatives who don't have a license promptly get one, and the council agrees to list them on the policy and resume conversations. What happens if, a year or two into the future, the council decides it doesn't like a representative of the SPA and cancels their busking license? Should that busker immediately be evicted from the SPA? Are they immediately fired from SPA leadership? Do council officers really believe that they should have veto powers over who gets to be on the other side of the table during negotiations? The report's authors evidently know how awful they're being. It's why they keep slipping into the passive voice. For example, the concept of SPAs is still seen as a positive and worth supporting by the council. However, it was emphasised that SPAs should only represent licensed buskers, or it is believed that a new forum should be established which is specifically for licensed buskers. It's at these moments, when the report slips into externalising views onto nameless sources, that its authors sound at their most insidious. The rest of the aforementioned miscalculations and misinterpretations of the law could conceivably be mistakes. Maybe even the council's insulting history of busking should get a pass. But trying to meddle with the governing rules of a trade association, while writing it as if it's an accepted viewpoint established by outsiders rather than their own opinion, well, it is believed that these are the words of some bitter employees trying to mislead the council. I'm going to leave out the names and the actions of individual council officials who the buskers believe are to blame for all of this, or the evidence that has stacked up against them. This video is long enough already, and that information can be handed over to the press. But I've been shown an email thread where one Covent Garden SPA representative tried, repeatedly, from November 20th, 2022 until August 3rd, 2023, a period of 8.5 months, to get the council to walk around town with the SPA to discuss specific pitch issues. He was either ignored or rebuffed every time. Here's how the report talks about the CG-SPA cooperation. All attempts to engage with the Covent Garden Street Performers Association failed. That's got things backwards. All attempts to engage with the council failed. The same council that didn't even meet its own obligation of holding a twice-annual forum. Whomever is writing this stuff needs to stop, take a breath, and apologise. Otherwise, I really can't imagine how the SPAs will be able to move on. The next one is a small point. Well, actually it's quite a large point, but one that can be made quickly. The council needs to apologise for not letting buskers know that they couldn't work. Westminster only has 5 amplified pitches. As we've already covered, many shows require amplification nowadays, and the Traffic Island and Marble Arch pitches were put in awful locations, which means that there is a lot of competition for the remaining 3. But also, the St. Paul's pitch is used exclusively by street theatre shows, the comedy circus-style shows with big audiences, and it's been that way since the 1980s. That leaves just Trafalgar Square and Leicester Square for amplified musicians, dancers, and so on to compete over. Over the last couple of years, the report notes that Trafalgar Square was closed for events for roughly 59 days per year. Leicester Square was closed for roughly 154 days. Do the maths, and we see that buskers could expect both Trafalgar Square and Leicester Square pitches to be closed at the same time about 25 days per year. Actually, according to the buskers, pitch closures are generally more common on weekends and during the summer and winter tourism spikes, so the real number of dual closures is likely higher, and, on average, on high-earning days. But anyway, approximately 25 times a year, hundreds of street performers would pack up their equipment, leave home, and commute into town only to find that there's nowhere that they can legally busk. According to the report, 70% of street performers had no idea how to check for pitch closures because the council didn't tell them. So, the report recommends, 2 years too late mind you, that the council should consider additional communication options about pitch closures. Considering the council sold buskers the right to busk in their borough, the report should probably also have recommended giving their licensees an apology. Okay, I know what you're thinking, I'm really scraping the bottom of the apology barrel, so let's switch it up again. The report's authors recommend a change to the rules so that buskers can lose their licenses for directing, quote, offensive language at authorised officers or the police. They call this unacceptable behaviour. That might be their opinion, but even the House of Lords thought that anybody should be allowed to insult anyone, including the police, when they voted to change the terms of the Public Order Act of 1986. It would seem that the House of Lords is more anti-establishment than whichever council officer wrote this. But that's nothing compared to point F in this list, which is so out there, I wouldn't be surprised to discover it's a crime for the council to even suggest it. The report recommends that buskers shall fully cooperate with any investigation carried out by the council or the police in response to reported incidents or allegations of unacceptable behaviour, and that fully cooperating would include assisting in the identification of any involved parties being investigated. In plain English, lose your license or rat on your friends. How's that for cooperation and engagement? And finally, the council should apologise for passing this legislation and having it go into effect during the catastrophe that was COVID. At the time, dozens of live performance venues had permanently gone out of business across the UK, and 100 more establishments would follow. Indoor venues were decimated by COVID. The Great Outdoors was considered the one COVID-safe venue when lockdowns ended, and many artists had nowhere else to perform. COVID also wiped out an entire year's worth of artists' earnings. Buskers obviously didn't benefit from the government's furlough scheme, or their super spreader Eat Out to Help Out scheme, and they couldn't apply for any of the arts grants that were out there. They weren't even invited to perform at the parties going on at number 10. The entire busking community was experiencing an unprecedented level of stress and hardship, and nobody knew what was going to happen. And at that point, in the middle of a lockdown, the council passed legislation that made their shows illegal, ending, for many, any hope that the future would be brighter than the present. It was just brutal. We're almost there. There's just one final section to explore, the council's recommendations for how to fix things. One more time. Engagement, cooperation, and enforcement. The trifecta of what's needed for this licensing regime to work. Recommendation 1 is a massive increase in police and council resources. That's the enforcement part. We'll let the council argue against themselves here. As they already stated, additional partnership action relating to the compliance and enforcement of this regime will continue. However, this will be subject to other policing priorities not taking precedence, and this approach is unlikely to be sustainable in the long term. Why unsustainable? Well, already Westminster is the most dangerous borough per capita in London, with 298 crimes per 1,000 people. That's 260% higher than the national crime rate. Already back in 2017, the Metropolitan Police was accused of giving shoplifters the green light after stating it was going to ignore most cases of low-level crime. Since then, the rental and cost of living crises have hit hard. These kinds of crimes have increased, meaning that the police simply don't have the resources needed to add to their workload. As the report stated, the police were approached to support our officers in undertaking their role. Whilst these requests were made, the police had other significant priorities that took precedence over the enforcement of illegal buskers. In fact, the report even claims that council officers told police officers that buskers had physically threatened them, and still the police refused to act. In other words, criminals who are refusing to stop committing an actual crime and who have physically threatened council officers while in the middle of committing that crime could still not motivate the police to act. That is how little regard the police have for the new regime. I mean, of course, they don't care that Covent Garden is still going on like it has done for centuries, and nowhere in the 114 pages of this report do the authors describe why or how that opinion would change. And to make matters worse, just a couple of weeks ago, the news was reporting that Suella Braverman has demanded that the police stop twiddling their thumbs and begin investigating every theft. Well, unless the council rebrands street performances as theft, this would appear to make police enforcement even less likely. A side point here is that Westminster has inadvertently turned street performance into the borough's most commonly committed crime. None of the street performers on the West Piazza and Magic Corner have licenses. Therefore, each of their shows is a crime. Just those two pitches account for about 8,000 crimes a year. Add all the crimes committed by all the other buskers on all the other pitches in Westminster, and, well, the already saturated crime rate in Westminster looks like it just got a lot worse. This leads to an interesting question. If individual buskers are flagrantly committing hundreds of crimes per year, in the same locations, in broad daylight, in the centre of the busiest parts of town, on a constant schedule, and if they are even announcing their intention to commit said crimes in advance with the line, "It's showtime," why aren't more of them in jail? And, well, what was the point of this again? The 2023 report does not mention how much the council has actually spent on this, which should worry any councillor. But we can do some quick maths. First, the report claims that the processing and determining of each application cost the council £200. In 2022-23, they processed 514 applications, which, according to their estimate, must have cost them around £100,000. Then there's the PRS licence to pay. Unfortunately for Westminster, the local authority's busking pitch licence fee has just been increased to £13.12. Multiply that by 26 pitches, 365 days per year, and you get £125,000. Combined, just those two figures come to over £227,000. That's already 5 times the predicted operational cost. That figure doesn't include the enforcement or monitoring costs of the licensing program, nor does it include how much the council spends on responding to thousands of noise complaints a year, nor the meetings with key stakeholders, the public consultations, the data reviews, the writing of 114-page reports, or the council debates and all the other related costs. Worse still is the fact that the report repeatedly asks the council to significantly increase its budget. The council needs to, quote, evaluate the cost and resource implications of addressing persistent non-compliant and illegal buskers, requiring a significant investment in resources and costs, as well as ongoing support from the police to achieve. And to actively address the issues, there will be a need for significant council and police resources over a prolonged time. How do they want to pay for this? By raising the application fees for new licenses. Now, I feel it's important to mention that in the initial report back in 2020, the council estimated that setup costs would come to £73,500 and annual operational costs would be £43,985. Of that, they expected to earn just £2,400 a year in license application fees. That's 5.5% of their expected costs. In 2020, this was fine. The council admitted that in order to not erect a financial barrier, fees must be kept low. But in the 2023 report, the first mention describes them as low license fees, but then as very low fees, and then extremely low, preparing the councillors for their recommendation that the fees be increased. Okay, so let's go through the logic of increasing the cost of the license. The council thinks that there are good buskers and bad buskers. The good buskers get a license and play by the rules. According to the report, there are little to no issues with buskers that comply with the licensing requirements in the policy. The good buskers pay their £20 application fee, which is low enough not to be a financial barrier. The bad buskers don't get a license. Those bad buskers require more enforcement, meaning more money, which the council wants to get by increasing the fees. Oops, they've just created a financial barrier, so fewer buskers get a license. That's not to say fewer buskers busk, of course, there are just fewer that bother getting a license. Fewer buskers in the good pile means that there are more buskers in the bad pile, again increasing the enforcement costs. Will the council increase the fees even higher? Also, does the council not care that it will be charging the good people for the actions of the bad people? On to recommendation 3. Make pitch markings more durable and add information in Braille. Great. 4. Remove amplification from Leicester Square. If they did this, Westminster's amplified acts would be limited to Covent Garden for circle shows and a single licensed amplified pitch in Trafalgar Square for hundreds of musicians and dancers to split between them. Does that sound like anyone would bother signing up for a license if that was the case? 5. Let buskers know about pitch closures. Literally the least they could do. 6. Implement the forum, but excluding the SPAs or key stakeholders. 7. Remove current SPAs from being mentioned in the policy. 8. Add a section for hypothetical future SPAs to list contact details. We've just covered this. The report is proposing a massive decrease in cooperation between the council and current street performers associations to improve matters. 9. Adding text to the policy advising that buskers should probably get a PRS license. As mentioned earlier, this is, in legal terms, many layers of stupid. 10. Telling buskers to cooperate even more with officers and the police. Sure. And telling them not to lie on their application forms. Okay, sure. And updating the code of conduct to include those last 2 points. 13. My favourite recommendation, the lose your license if you don't rat on your friends and hey don't insult me clauses. 14. Buskers under the age of 18 must have parental consent. This is a weird addition considering that the council doesn't seem to have made the case that this is anything more than a hypothetical problem. And to round off this unsurprising bunch with 3 nondescript recommendations, assessing pitch locations, presumably to write about in a later report, keeping the license conditions under review, and making any other minor or non-consequential amendments. That's 1 suggestion that's unlikely to increase enforcement, 6 that will decrease cooperation and engagement, and 10 items that I bet not even the report's authors could remember if pressed. It is emphasised that little, if anything, would be likely to change, even if the council accepted all 17 of these pointless and petty recommendations. This scheme was implemented so badly it was doomed to fail from the start. The current council has inherited a shambles from the previous one, and the scheme should just be scrapped. It's time to work with your local street performers to find something that isn't just a pointless money sink. Get rid of this licensing scheme and enlist the help of the SPAs. Thanks.